Good morning, everyone. So we'll start our second day of the Institute Seminar Days. So the first speaker is Sitabhra Sinha. We'll talk about Devo-Eco.
All right, so good morning, and it's always a pleasure to speak to a home audience. So I'm going to talk about some recent work that we have been doing and which promises, in some sense, the emergence of a new area of science, which, I thought I had coined the term Devo-Eco, but Shondip just told me that he's already seen a few papers with this title. So anyway, so clearly it's something which is in, the Zeitgeist. So I'll explain what it is all about, but let me first thank my collaborators, Chandrasekhar Kumudi, who did his PhD, finished his PhD about a couple of years back, and Shakti Menon, who is of course in the audience. Yeah, so being a physicist, I always tell my collaborators who are from other disciplines that, we are arrogant bastards, right? And this is well encapsulated by Rutherford's famous quote, "Science? There's only physics, the rest is stamp collecting," right? And when you look at biology as a physicist, it looks like the ultimate in stamp collecting, right? At least that's what used to appear to me when I was a high school student, so much so that I refused to take biology as a subject in my 11-12. Sorry?
Rutherford got a Nobel in chemistry.
That's true. Yeah. So, but according to him, it's actually all physics, right? So anyway, so because biology seems like a loose leaf of just disparate facts. What's the connecting thread? Okay. So as a physicist, you start asking, are there universal organizing principles like in physics? Right? Now, biologists may kind of, find this a very weird kind of way to ask things about biology, because why should all sciences have this thing? But when you're a physicist, you just can't help it. It's in your training, right? And in some sense, the first glimpse into such an universal organizing principle, one might say, as physicists are concerned, would be Crick's famous central dogma, Crick and Watson you might say, but essentially which said that, all of life follows this principle where the information that is central to life is encoded in the nucleic acid, DNA, which essentially is converted to RNA, and then the RNA is used to create proteins. So the interesting part is that the letters used by DNA, the nucleotides, are distinct from the letters used by the protein, which are amino acids. And so you need a translation process to go from this language to this language. And essentially the central dogma connects these two great polymer languages of life. So that's actually a brilliant organizing principle which connects essentially life on Earth, all of life on Earth as we know it. So, if you're studying life from a molecular point of view, this seems like, as good a candidate as any. However, about a decade back, I was attending a talk by Amitav Joshi. Many of you might know him. He's an ecologist in the JNCSR in Bangalore. And he gave this brilliant, figure. The figure is my adaptation of what he said. Where he said that, look, there is a grand unified theory of biology. And it goes like this. It involves three basic concepts, that of genotype. Okay, so basically it's the set of all genes which essentially make up a particular cell. And phenotype, which is the external appearance of the organism and the behavior associated with it and so on and so forth. And fitness. Okay? And how do you connect these three basic features? Well, the genotype essentially determines the phenotype by the process known as development. Okay? So when you are born, you're born as a single cell. So all the information that is required to create this, what you see over here, this multicellular organism, is there in that single cell. But how do you actually take that information encoded within DNA to create something, which looks like me? That is, of course, still not completely understood, and that forms the crux of the area in biology known as developmental biology. Okay. All right, so you have individuals now who look like something, who are interacting with other individuals of the same type and other individuals of a different species altogether. And this essentially creates their environment. And that is studied by the area of biology known as ecology, right? So this is what determines the fitness of a particular phenotype or of a particular organism. So fitness is essentially how well you do with respect to others of your kind and others of different species, all right? And finally, it's this fitness which makes, through natural selection, certain phenotypes and thereby genotypes much more likely to survive to the next generation. And this is, of course, the famous theory of evolution through natural selection, okay? And so, Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace had essentially, came up almost simultaneously with this concept of fitness, which is this individual reproductive success. So, it doesn't matter, how endowed you are. What matters is how many offsprings, viable offsprings you leave behind, because that will determine how fit you are. And this essentially results in a certain set of heritable characteristics of an organism to be better at it than others, which finally lead to this observable characteristic or traits of an organism. So I remember once, talking about this with my former graduate student Anand, who was, one of those people who were obsessed about a particular branch of science, and for his case, it was neuroscience. So, he might, to paraphrase Rutherford, to him, everything was neuroscience. The rest was completely boring, right? And he asked me, where in this diagram is neuroscience? It makes no sense if neuroscience is not there. So I thought, maybe there's a point there. And so I realized that, okay, actually phenotype is not just about organization and not just about, what you see, it's also your behavior. And so essentially you're talking about genotype determining behavior, but as we all know, that's a really difficult problem to go from genes to behavior. And Sidney Brenner, who's shown here, actually pointed out that instead of trying to directly go from genes to behavior, it's way easier to break it into two problems, namely, how does the genotype determine the nervous system? And how does the nervous system determine behavior? And so you have neuroscience appearing here, and genotypes determining brain is, of course, part of developmental biology. All right, so that, in a nutshell, is my modified view of Amitav Joshi's grand unified theory. And then, people have, of course, been looking at these things for over 100 years. As you can see, these people are basically from the 19th century, right? Except Sidney Brenner, who's from the 20th century. But the new development is that now people are finding that only talking about evolution or only talking about developmental biology, only talking about ecology in isolation with others cannot explain certain phenomena. And so then you have new sciences developing which combines various aspects of, for say, evolution and development. So this is the science of Devo-Eco, which developed about, I think, 2 or 3 decades back, which essentially compares how do different organisms develop. And by this, they're trying to see how the process of development itself evolved. Okay? So if you have single-celled organism, of course, there's no question of development. But the moment you have multicellularity, then you have to start from a single cell, you have to keep dividing, and finally you have to become a recognizably human, or a recognizably tiger, or a recognizably duck, or whatever. All right? So how do these developmental processes evolve over time? So that's essentially this science of Devo-Eco. A little later came another in some sense, interdisciplinary science, the science of Eco-Evo, or rather I should call it Devo-Eco, because it's evolutionary ecology, which examines how interactions between and within species evolve. Okay, so let's say I eat something, right? And that species eats something else, and that species eats something else. So these are trophic relations. But, how did it evolve? Okay, so we know that certain species can only eat something very specific, namely pandas eat only grass. We eat everything, right? So why is it that certain organisms have evolved this extremely specialized approach to having food? Others are essentially omnivores, okay? Right? 1 more minute, okay. It's, wow, thank you. All right, so essentially what we are doing is basically looking at this third branch, namely, how do interactions with other cells and environment influence development? Essentially, we are looking at how the ecology, that is the environment and the interactions with other organisms essentially affect the development. And why do we need it? Essentially to understand how we go from the single cell to this entire creature. Okay, I just wanted to show this particular picture to show you why this is of interest. So this is something called the zebra fish, a fish which has this stripe-like striations, which is why it's called a zebra. Essentially, it's a fish. Okay, so some problem with the movie, of course, as usual, it has to happen. Oh yeah, right. So, so it starts from a single cell, and then it develops, okay, over time into something which is recognizably a fish embryo. Okay, so you will see that, you know, so far it looks pretty much like a spherical cell, and then over time, a kind of asymmetry will happen. So, you know, you can start already seeing the formation of this asymmetry. So this is the head, and this is the tail, and then the backbone is gradually developing, and then you will see that suddenly this part will, you know, disengage from the yolk and start developing into a recognizable tail. You can see the beginnings of the eye and the brain, and so on and so forth, and then gradually, you know, so this is basically counting in seconds. You know, so this is basically showing you how at 52 hours post-fertilization is going to look like. And so now you can see it pretty much looks like a fish embryo. All right. Okay, so since I'm out of time, I will just scoot across to my final slide to just show you that essentially what we are doing is to understand how local interactions, that is, interaction between neighboring cells, interacting with a global field, essentially through the diffusion of morphogen or chemicals, allows the particular form that we characterize with an organism like a human or a zebrafish to develop. And where physics comes in the fact is that this is something which will be very familiar with people who do, for example, statistical physics. So if you're doing spin models, we know that the spins interact with their nearest neighbors, but they also respond to an external field. And in some sense, you can actually map this problem of developmental ecology to a problem in statistical physics where you're asking how does local interaction between cells essentially interacting with a global field like a morphogen concentration gradient give rise to the complex patterns that we characterize with an organism. So let me end by thanking the people who are associated with it. As I said, Chandrasekhar, who finished PhD a couple of years back and now is postdoc at Harvard, and Shakti Menon, who is of course in the audience, and of course acknowledged funding from the Department of Atomic Energy.
Thanks a lot for the very nice talk.